The water in the copper bathtub had gone from clear to chaos in the span of a single, irreversible moment. Steam rose in thick clouds against the afternoon light filtering through the tall windows of the bathing room, creating an otherworldly fog that seemed to separate this space from the rest of Blackridge estate, from the rest of Mississippi, from the rest of the world where children did not do what Samuel was doing now. His hands pressed down on Cordelia Blackridge's shoulders with a force he didn't know his thin arms possessed. 14 years of servitude had made him small, made him quick, made him nearly invisible, but they had also made his grip iron strong from carrying water buckets and scrubbing floors and enduring punishments that required him to hold positions until his muscles screamed. Now those same muscles, trained through suffering, kept her beneath the surface even as every instinct told him to let go, to run, to undo this moment that could never be undone. The water churned violent and dark around her thrashing form. What had been carefully prepared bathwater, heated to precisely the temperature she demanded, scented with lavender oil imported from France, drawn to the exact depth she required, had become something else entirely. It had become a drowning pool. It had become the instrument of an act that would echo through the halls of this decaying mansion long after both of them were gone. Cordelia's body convulsed beneath his hands with a strength that terrified him. She was a grown woman, 34 years old, well-fed and healthy in the way that only the mistress of a plantation could be. He was a boy who had known hunger more often than satisfaction, whose growth had been stunted by inadequate food and excessive labor. By all rights, she should have been able to overpower him easily, to throw him off and emerge from the water gasping and furious and ready to deliver a punishment that would make all her previous cruelties seem gentle by comparison. But Samuel had surprise on his side. He had desperation. He had the geometric advantage of position, standing over the tub, his full weight pressed downward through arms locked at the elbow, while she struggled from below in a medium that offered no leverage, no purchase, no mercy. And perhaps most importantly, he had reached that place beyond fear where the body moves with a terrible, crystalline clarity because the mind has already accepted that death is coming, that survival is impossible, that the only choice left is how you meet your end. Her fingers clawed at his wrists, nails digging deep enough to draw blood. He felt the warm trickle running down his forearms, mixing with the bath water that had splashed over the sides of the copper tub to soak his worn cotton shirt and darken the marble floor in spreading pools. The pain was sharp and immediate, but it seemed distant somehow, as though it were happening to someone else's body. His hands didn't loosen. They couldn't loosen. If he let go now, there would be no second chance, and he had already crossed a threshold from which there was no return. The bathroom door was locked from the inside. He had turned the heavy brass key in its mechanism with hands that shook so badly he'd nearly dropped it. That simple click, metal sliding into metal, the bolt seating itself with mechanical finality, had been the true point of no return. Everything before that moment could have been explained away, apologized for, perhaps even forgiven with sufficient groveling and the right amount of pain accepted in penance. But the locked door declared intention. It announced premeditation. It transformed what might have been a momentary impulse into something calculated and unforgivable. Cordelia's struggles were beginning to weaken. Samuel could feel it through his hands, through the decreasing violence of the water's surface, through the way her fingers, which had been tearing at his flesh with desperate strength, now seemed to be losing their grip on consciousness itself. Her body's convulsions were becoming sporadic rather than constant. The bubbles rising from beneath the surface, her breath escaping, her lungs filling with water that should have cleansed but was instead drowning, were coming less frequently. His own breath came in ragged gasps that had nothing to do with physical exertion and everything to do with the magnitude of what was happening. Tears streamed down his face, mixing with the steam and the bathwater spray. He was crying, had been crying since the moment he'd pushed her under, but his arms remained steady. His whole body shook with sobs, with terror, with the weight of this act, but his hands stayed fixed to her shoulders as surely as if they'd been nailed there. Outside the windows, beyond the steam and the struggle and the dying, the world continued with an indifference that seemed almost cruel in its normalcy. The afternoon sun streamed through the branches of ancient magnolia trees, dappling the lawn with light and shadow. Somewhere in the distance, Samuel could hear the rhythmic work songs of the field hands, their voices carrying across the cotton rows in melodies that spoke of endurance and hope and a faith he wasn't sure he'd ever possessed. Birds sang in the garden. A dog barked near the stables. Life went on, utterly unaware that in this marble-floored room with its copper tub and imported fixtures and trappings of civilization, a child was committing an act that would define him forever. What does it take to drive a human being to murder? Not in the heat of passion, not in a moment of sudden rage, but with enough forethought to lock a door, to wait for the right moment, to calculate the mechanics of how to keep another person underwater long enough for death to claim them? Samuel had asked himself this question in the 3 sleepless nights leading up to this moment, and he had found no answer that satisfied. He knew only that the alternative, continuing to exist in a world where Cordelia Blackridge held absolute power over him, where she could hurt him and anyone he cared about with impunity, where his life was worth less than the bathwater now being used to end hers, had become more unbearable than the prospect of his own death. Because he would die for this. He knew that with the same certainty he knew the sun would rise tomorrow, though he would not be alive to see it. Mississippi law was clear and merciless. Enslaved people who killed white people did not receive trials with juries and deliberation. They received swift, brutal justice designed to terrify others into submission. He would hang, probably within days of this discovery. They might torture him first, trying to extract the names of accomplices who didn't exist, seeking a conspiracy where there was only a desperate boy and a moment of unbearable clarity. The knowledge of his coming death should have made this moment impossible. Self-preservation is perhaps the strongest of all human instincts. Yet here he was, watching the struggles beneath his hands grow weaker, knowing that each passing second sealed his fate more completely, and still he did not let go. What did that say about him? What did it say about the system that had brought him to this point? What did it say about the institution of slavery itself that it could create circumstances where a child would choose certain death over continued existence? Cordelia's body gave one final, convulsive shudder beneath the surface. Her hands, which had fallen away from his wrists, floated limply in the water. The churning stilled. The bathroom fell into a silence so complete that Samuel could hear his own heartbeat pounding in his ears, could hear the drip of water from his soaked sleeves onto the marble floor, could hear the distant sound of those field songs that now seemed to be singing a funeral dirge for both the woman in the bathtub and the boy who had put her there. He counted to 100 before he allowed himself to release his grip. His mother had taught him to count before she died, passing on that forbidden knowledge in whispered lessons when the overseers weren't watching. Now he used that gift to ensure completion, to make certain that life had truly left Cordelia's body before he stepped back. 1. 2. 3. Each number was a prayer and a curse. 4. 5. 6. Each digit another nail in his own coffin. But he counted steadily, his lips moving silently, because if he was going to do this thing, he would do it completely. There would be no resurrection, no miraculous recovery, no chance for her to return and make him wish he'd been more thorough. At 100, he lifted his hands. They trembled violently now that they were no longer fixed in purpose. Blood ran freely from the scratches on his wrists, crimson threads in the clear water that dripped from his fingers. His clothes were soaked through, clinging to his thin frame and dripping onto the expensive marble that Cordelia had insisted be imported from Italy at enormous cost. The irony wasn't lost on him, she had cared more about the stone beneath her feet than about the human beings who walked on it. Cordelia floated face down in the copper tub, her dark hair spreading around her head like seaweed, like a halo, like accusation itself. Her silk bathing gown billowed around her body, creating the illusion of movement where there was now only stillness. Her arms hung suspended in the water, fingers slightly curled, as though even in death she was reaching for something just beyond her grasp. Perhaps it was life. Perhaps it was the bell pull that would have summoned help. Perhaps it was understanding of how she had created her own murderer through years of calculated cruelty. Samuel stood beside the tub, water pooling around his bare feet, and stared at what he had done. He felt no triumph. The stories he'd heard, whispered tales of rebellion and resistance, had spoken of victorious moments when the oppressed struck back against their oppressors. But there was no victory in this marble room with its cooling bath water and floating corpse. There was only exhaustion and horror and the certain knowledge that he had traded her life for his own in a transaction that benefited no one. His legs threatened to give out beneath him. He stumbled backward until his shoulders hit the wall, then slid down to sit on the wet floor, his knees drawn up to his chest, his arms wrapped around himself as though he could hold the pieces of himself together through sheer force of will. He couldn't look away from the bathtub, from the body that had been a living, breathing person moments ago and was now just meat and memory. He had done that. His hands, these small, scarred hands that had carried her tea and brushed her hair and endured her torments, had become instruments of death. What could drive a child to this? What accumulation of small cruelties and large injustices could transform a 14-year-old boy into a killer? What system of oppression could be so complete, so suffocating, so absolute in its denial of humanity that murder seemed like the only path to dignity? These questions hung in the steam-filled air of the bathing room, unanswered and perhaps unanswerable, as heavy as the body in the water and as permanent as the blood drying on Samuel's wrists. The afternoon light shifted slightly as the sun moved behind a cloud. The bathroom dimmed. In the sudden shadow, Samuel closed his eyes and waited for the inevitable discovery, knowing that the real horror of this story was just beginning. To understand how a child's hands could become instruments of death, one must first understand the place that forged those hands, the place that made murder seem like mercy, that turned desperation into action. One must understand Blackridge estate, and the woman who ruled it with a cruelty as refined as her manners. The estate sat 7 miles outside Natchez, Mississippi, perched on a bluff overlooking the Mississippi River like a rotting monument to wealth built on suffering. 800 acres of cotton fields stretched in every direction, worked by nearly 200 enslaved people whose labor had built the fortune that Master Thaddeus Blackridge displayed with ostentatious pride. The main house was a Greek Revival structure, massive white columns supporting a portico that promised grandeur, symmetry that suggested order, architectural ambition that declared the permanence of a system that would crumble within 2 decades. But by 1845, that crumbling had already begun. The white paint on those magnificent columns was peeling, revealing brick beneath like skin sloughing off a corpse. Elaborate ironwork balconies imported from New Orleans had begun to rust in the humid Mississippi air, leaving red stains down the facade like dried blood. The marble steps leading to the front entrance had cracked during a harsh winter, spiderwebbing across the stone in patterns that seemed almost prophetic. The gardens, once carefully maintained, had decayed into oppressive wilderness. Spanish moss hung from live oaks in gray curtains that swayed in the slightest breeze, creating shadows that moved when nothing else did. Magnolia trees had grown wild and untamed, their enormous white blooms releasing a scent so heavy and sweet it pressed down on the air itself, making it difficult to breathe. Jasmine climbed the walls with invasive tenacity, its vines working between bricks and into mortar, slowly pulling the structure apart from outside while rot did the same from within. Inside, the house maintained appearances while hiding decay. The entrance hall boasted hand-painted silk wallpaper depicting European pastoral scenes that had nothing to do with the cotton fields and suffering that had paid for them. But water damage from leaking roofs had created brown stains that no amount of careful furniture arrangement could hide. Crystal chandeliers still sparkled when lit, but several crystals were missing, leaving gaps like missing teeth in a smile. The floorboards had warped from moisture and age, creating subtle slopes that made walking feel disorienting, as though the house itself were tilting toward inevitable collapse. This was the domain over which Cordelia Blackridge had ruled for 2 years, ever since Thaddeus had brought her back from Charleston as his second wife. His first wife, Margaret, had died in childbirth along with the infant son who might have carried on the Blackridge name. Margaret had been cold and distant, managing the household enslaved people with the efficiency of someone managing livestock, but her cruelty had been the cruelty of indifference rather than intention. Cordelia was different. Cordelia's cruelty was art. She had been born Cordelia Whitmore, daughter of a Charleston shipping family whose fortune had declined with the rise of railroads. By her early 30s, unmarried and watching her family's social position erode with their finances, she had accepted Thaddeus Blackridge's proposal with calculating practicality. He was 20 years her senior, coarse in his manners, and absent from the estate for weeks at a time on business trips to New Orleans and Memphis. But he was wealthy, and he needed a wife to manage his household and provide the heir his first wife had failed to deliver. What Thaddeus got in return was a woman who transformed the management of enslaved people from mere economic necessity into an expression of her own frustrated ambitions and carefully cultivated sadism. Cordelia was beautiful in the way that porcelain dolls are beautiful, pale skin that she protected from the sun with parasols and wide-brimmed hats, dark hair worn in elaborate styles that required an enslaved woman's labor for hours each morning, features regular and refined in a way that suggested good breeding. She dressed in the latest fashions from Paris, or at least approximations that could be ordered through catalogs. Her dresses rustled when she walked, layers of silk and crinoline announcing her presence before she entered a room. But her eyes told the truth about her. They were pale blue, almost gray, and they held a coldness that had nothing to do with color and everything to do with the absence of empathy behind them. When she looked at the enslaved people who served in her house, she saw nothing that reminded her of her own humanity. She saw props in the theater of her life, objects that existed solely to affirm her status and absorb her frustrations. She carried a riding crop throughout the house, though she never rode. She claimed it was for posture correction, and indeed she would use it to tap the backs of servants who failed to stand straight enough, who moved too slowly, who breathed too loudly in her presence. The tap would be light, almost playful, but the threat behind it was always clear. The crop was a promise: step too far out of line, and the correction would be significantly more severe. Her domain was the house and its immediate grounds, while Thaddeus concerned himself with the fields. This division of labor was common, but Cordelia took her role with a seriousness that bordered on obsession. She ran the household with military precision, maintaining schedules and routines that governed every moment of every enslaved person's day. Breakfast was served at precisely 6 o'clock. The parlor was dusted at 9. Her bath was drawn at 2 in the afternoon and again at 8 in the evening. Deviation from these schedules was punished swiftly and creatively. The house slaves lived in constant tension, never knowing which small mistake would trigger her displeasure. She would sometimes ignore blatant errors, only to explode in rage over some microscopic imperfection: a water glass with a single fingerprint, a flower arrangement with blooms that weren't perfectly symmetrical. This unpredictability was itself a form of torture, keeping everyone in perpetual anxiety, unable to develop strategies for avoiding her wrath because it followed no logical pattern. She was particularly cruel to children. Perhaps because she had not yet produced the heir Thaddeus expected, perhaps because children's vulnerability gave her a sense of power she craved, or perhaps simply because cruelty, like any skill, improves with practice on those least able to resist. The enslaved children who worked in the house learned quickly that Cordelia's attention was something to be avoided at all costs. She would host elaborate parties, inviting neighboring plantation families to display her skills as a hostess. The dining table would groan under the weight of food prepared by enslaved cooks. Enslaved children would serve, dressed in livery she had designed, moving silently between guests, refilling glasses and clearing plates with the invisible efficiency she demanded. During these parties, Cordelia would play the piano. She was genuinely skilled, having received the musical education expected of women of her class, and her guests would murmur appreciation of her cultural refinement. They would compliment the food, the decor, the smooth operation of her household. They would not see, or would choose not to see, the terror in the eyes of the children serving them, the bruises carefully hidden beneath sleeves and collars, the way the house slaves moved with the rigid precision of people who knew that any mistake would be paid for after the guests departed. After parties ended, after guests had ridden away in their carriages, Cordelia would conduct her inspections. She would examine every room, running her fingers across surfaces to check for dust, examining dishes, looking for any evidence that her standards had not been maintained. These post-party inspections were dreaded above all other times, because Cordelia would invariably find something wrong, a curtain not hanging quite straight, some microscopic failure that gave her license to punish. The punishments varied according to her mood and imagination. Sometimes they were physical, lashes with a switch or confinement in the root cellar for hours in complete darkness. Sometimes they were psychological, forcing children to destroy something they valued, or to witness punishments delivered to others for their mistakes. Sometimes they were practical, withholding food, assigning impossible tasks, creating no-win situations where failure was inevitable and punishment was assured. But always, there was the underlying message: you are nothing, you exist at my pleasure, your suffering is both deserved and inconsequential. This message was delivered through every interaction, every glance, every casual cruelty. It was reinforced by the system itself, by laws that defined enslaved people as property rather than persons, by a society that celebrated refinement while ignoring the brutality that made such comfort possible. The irony was that Cordelia's cruelty was enabled and protected by the very system of civilization she claimed to represent. Her education, her manners, her musical skill, her elaborate dinner parties, all of these markers of culture existed alongside and depended upon the systematic dehumanization of the people she tortured. She could be both the accomplished hostess playing Chopin in her parlor and the sadist burning a child's hands with curling irons. These were not contradictions in her world. They were complementary aspects of the same social order. This was the world Samuel had known since age 7. This was the house where he had learned that survival meant silence, that dignity was a luxury he could not afford, that hope was dangerous because it made the present unbearable. And this was the woman whose body now floated in a copper bathtub, her reign of terror ended by the hands of a child she had tormented into becoming her killer. Blackridge Estate in August of 1845 was a place where horror wore silk dresses and spoke with cultured accents, where violence was administered with the same casual precision as flower arrangements, where the real monstrosity was not the act of murder that had just occurred, but the system of brutality that had made such an act inevitable. Samuel had not always been the boy with murder in his hands. There had been a time, brief and distant as a half-remembered dream, when he had been simply a child, his mother's child, with a future that might have contained something other than this bathroom floor slick with blood and bathwater. He had been born in the winter of 1831 in one of the slave quarters behind the main house, delivered by his grandmother's hands while wind howled through the gaps in the wooden walls. His mother, Grace, had worked the fields then, her hands moving through cotton bowls with the practiced efficiency of someone who had known no other life since childhood. She had named him Samuel after a grandfather he would never meet, sold away years before to a plantation in Alabama. The name meant, God has heard, in the Hebrew his mother couldn't read but had learned from whispered stories passed down through generations. Whether God had actually heard the prayers of enslaved people was a question Samuel would wrestle with in the years to come. His early childhood existed in fragments of memory, his mother's voice singing low spirituals in the evening, the taste of cornbread she somehow made special with nothing but water and salt, the way she would trace letters in the dirt when the overseers weren't watching, teaching him shapes that held meaning. Those memories felt like they belonged to a different person, a different life, a different world than the one he now inhabited. Everything changed when he was 7 years old. Grace had contracted a fever during the wet season, when the lowlands around the estate bred mosquitoes and disease with equal abundance. The plantation physician, such as he was, had not been summoned for a field hand's illness. Grace had worked through the fever until she couldn't stand, then she had lain in the quarters burning with heat while Samuel pressed wet rags to her forehead and begged her not to leave him. She died on a Tuesday morning in April, and by Wednesday afternoon Samuel had been moved to the main house to begin his new duties. Margaret Blackridge, the first wife, had needed a new house servant after one of the older boys had been sold following some minor theft. Samuel was young enough to be trained, old enough to be useful, and freshly orphaned, which meant he had no parents who might cause trouble if discipline became harsh. He was assigned to general household duties initially, carrying water, polishing silver, running errands between rooms. The work was exhausting for a 7-year-old, but it was infinitely preferable to field work, and it came with marginally better food and the possibility of sleeping indoors during winter. For 2 years, Samuel existed in the strange liminal space of house servants, neither quite visible nor completely invisible, moving through the rooms of white people's lives like a shadow that carried things and cleaned things and was expected to have no thoughts or feelings of its own. Margaret Blackridge barely looked at him. Her cruelty was the passive kind, the cruelty of someone who simply didn't register the humanity of the people serving her. Samuel learned to move silently, to anticipate needs before they were spoken, to make himself as unremarkable as furniture. Then Margaret died, and Cordelia arrived, and everything that had been merely difficult became unbearable. Cordelia had taken particular interest in Samuel almost immediately. Perhaps it was because he was young and therefore more easily molded to her exacting standards. Perhaps it was because his silent efficiency had caught her attention. Or perhaps it was simply random chance, the casual way that predators sometimes single out particular prey. Whatever the reason, within weeks of her arrival at Blackridge Estate, Samuel had been assigned as her personal attendant. The role meant constant proximity to her. He prepared her morning tea, laid out her clothes, helped her dress, standing motionless while she used him as a living mannequin to drape fabrics and test arrangements. He carried her parasol when she walked in the garden. He drew her baths twice daily, testing the water temperature with his hand until it met her precise specifications. He served her meals, standing behind her chair in the dining room, ready to refill her glass or fetch another dish from the kitchen. He brushed her hair at night, 100 strokes exactly, counting silently while trying to keep his arms from shaking with fatigue. Every moment in her presence was an exercise in hypervigilance. He learned to read the subtle shifts in her mood, the way her jaw would tighten slightly before she found fault with something, the particular tone her voice took when she was building toward punishment, the dangerous quiet that meant she was deciding how to make someone suffer. He developed an almost supernatural awareness of his own body, controlling every gesture, every expression, every breath to avoid giving her any excuse to notice him in the wrong way. But despite his best efforts, he could not avoid her cruelty. It found him with the inevitability of rain. She burned his palms with hot curling irons when the bathwater was a degree too cool, pressing the heated metal against his skin until it blistered, then sending him back to work as though nothing had happened. His hands bore the permanent scars of these corrections, circular brands on his palms that made gripping things painful even years later. She forced him to kneel on dried corn kernels for hours when he had failed to anticipate that she wanted her shawl before she asked for it, the hard kernels pressing into his kneecaps until they bled through his thin pants. She withheld his food for days, then made him stand in the dining room and watch her waste elaborate meals, scraping half-eaten portions into the slop bucket while she described how ungrateful he was for the charity of being fed at all. But the worst torment was psychological. Cordelia seemed to understand instinctively that the most effective cruelty wasn't physical pain but the destruction of hope itself. She told him his mother had died because God was punishing her wickedness, that Grace was burning in hell for the sin of bearing a child in bondage, that Samuel himself carried that corruption in his blood. She told him he was stupid, worthless, that his very existence was an affront she tolerated only out of Christian charity. She told him these things in the same cultured voice she used to discuss poetry with dinner guests, making degradation sound like simple observation of fact. The morning that changed everything, the morning that set him on the path to that bathroom floor, had started like any other. Samuel had been helping Cordelia dress, his fingers working quickly to fasten the tiny buttons up the back of her gown. His hand had slipped, just for a moment, and his fingernail had caught on the delicate lace at her sleeve. The fabric tore, a small rip barely an inch long, insignificant except for what it represented, his failure, his clumsiness, his inevitable imperfection. Cordelia had gone very still. She had looked at the torn lace for a long moment, then at Samuel's terrified face, and then she had smiled. That smile was more frightening than rage would have been. "Fetch Ezra from the kitchen," she had said quietly. Ezra was 12 years old, small for his age, with quick hands that made him valuable for kitchen work and a gentle nature that made him Samuel's only friend in the house. They had learned to read together, sharing a stolen hymnal and teaching each other letters by candlelight after the household had gone to sleep. Ezra had memorized passages of scripture and would recite them quietly while they worked, finding hope in words about deliverance and freedom that seemed to have nothing to do with their actual lives. When Ezra arrived, confused and frightened, Cordelia had presented Samuel with a choice. "You may receive 20 lashes from the overseer," she said, or Ezra may receive 10. Choose. Samuel had tried to choose himself. He had begged, had offered to take 50 lashes, had prostrated himself on the floor in a display of submission that made him hate himself even as he performed it. But Cordelia had simply smiled that terrible smile and said, "I've changed my mind. Ezra will receive the lashes regardless. But now you'll watch and know that you caused this." They had taken Ezra to the courtyard. They had stripped his shirt and tied his hands to the whipping post. And Samuel had been forced to stand 3 feet away while the overseer delivered 10 lashes with a leather strap, each impact producing a sound like wet meat being slapped against stone. Ezra had not cried out, perhaps knowing that any sound would only make things worse, but Samuel had seen his body jerk with each blow, had seen the blood begin to seep through the welts rising on his back, had seen the way Ezra's knees had buckled by the 8th lash. Afterward, when Ezra could barely walk, Samuel had helped him back to the kitchen. Ezra had not blamed him, had even tried to comfort him, saying it wasn't so bad, that he'd endured worse. But Samuel had seen in Ezra's eyes the knowledge that they were both trapped in a system where love itself became a weapon used against them, where caring about another person only created more vulnerabilities for Cordelia to exploit. That incident had taught Samuel a fundamental truth: resistance was impossible because she held everyone he cared about hostage. Any attempt to protect himself would result in others suffering in his place. The system was designed to make them complicit in their own oppression, to turn their bonds with each other into chains that bound them more securely than any physical restraints. For 3 weeks after that, Samuel had moved through his duties in a state of numb despair. His hands performed their tasks automatically while his mind retreated to some inner space where the weight of hopelessness couldn't quite reach. He had begun to understand why some enslaved people simply gave up, why they would walk into the river with stones in their pockets or refuse food until their bodies gave out. Death began to seem less like an ending and more like a door to somewhere that had to be better than this. Then came the discovery that had changed everything. The morning Cordelia had found Samuel teaching Ezra to read using a discarded hymnal they had found in the trash heap behind the house. And what had followed from that discovery had finally answered the question of what it takes to turn a child into a killer. The answer was simpler and more terrible than Samuel could have imagined: it takes showing him that death is preferable to continued existence, and then taking away even the comfort of dying alone. The discovery happened on a humid morning in late July, 3 weeks before Samuel would stand in a bathroom with murder on his hands and death in his future. The air hung thick and motionless, the kind of heat that made even breathing feel like work, that turned simple movement into exhausting labor. Samuel had risen before dawn as always, had drawn Cordelia's morning bath, had laid out her clothes with the precision she demanded, had performed every ritual of his servitude with the automatic efficiency that came from years of practice. He had thought he was being careful. He had thought the hiding place was secure. The hymnal was old and water-damaged, its pages brittle with age and mildew. Someone had thrown it away months earlier, probably after the binding had cracked and several pages had fallen out. Samuel had retrieved it from the refuse pile behind the kitchen, had hidden it beneath a loose floorboard in the small closet where cleaning supplies were kept. It was missing the cover and the first 30 pages, but what remained was treasure: words, sentences, entire passages of text that he and Ezra could use to practice the reading their mothers had begun to teach them before those mothers had been taken by death or distance or the casual brutality of sale. They met in the early mornings, before the household truly woke, in that closet that smelled of lye soap and wood polish. Ezra would slip away from the kitchen for 15 minutes, claiming he needed to fetch more cleaning rags. Samuel would be waiting with the hymnal, and together they would trace their fingers under words, sounding out syllables, helping each other decode meaning from symbols that white people took for granted but that represented forbidden knowledge for enslaved people. Reading was illegal. Teaching enslaved people to read was a criminal offense in Mississippi, punishable by fines and imprisonment for white offenders, by lashes and worse for black ones. The reasoning behind such laws was transparent. Literacy meant access to information, to abolitionist literature, to the written passes required for travel, to the ability to forge documents and communicate across distances. Literacy was dangerous because it suggested that enslaved people possessed minds capable of independent thought, and the entire edifice of slavery required the pretense that they did not. Samuel and Ezra understood the risks. They understood that what they were doing could result in punishment severe beyond imagining. But the hunger for those words, for that connection to something larger than their daily suffering, was stronger than fear. In those stolen minutes with the hymnal spread between them, they were not property. They were human beings reaching for knowledge, for dignity, for some small rebellion against a system that insisted they were incapable of thought. On that July morning, Samuel had been so focused on the page before him, on helping Ezra decode a passage about deliverance and freedom, that he had not heard the footsteps approaching. Had not realized that Cordelia had risen earlier than usual, had come looking for him to attend to some trivial task, had followed the sound of whispered voices to the closet. The door had opened without warning. Sunlight had flooded the small space, and there they were, two boys crouched over a forbidden book, caught in an act that could not be explained away or minimized. For a moment, Cordelia had simply stood there, her pale eyes taking in the scene with an expression that Samuel would remember for the rest of his brief life. It was not anger, exactly. It was something more calculating, more pleased. It was the look of someone who had just been handed an opportunity. "Well," she had said softly, almost tenderly. "What do we have here?" Ezra had started to speak, to take the blame, to say it was his idea, but Samuel had cut him off. Some instinct told him that denial was pointless, that any attempt at explanation would only make things worse. He had simply closed the hymnal and stood, positioning himself slightly in front of Ezra, though what protection he thought he could offer was unclear even to himself. Cordelia had taken the hymnal from his hands, had flipped through its damaged pages with exaggerated curiosity. Teaching him to read, she had mused. How ambitious! How remarkably stupid! She had looked at Samuel then, really looked at him, and he had seen in her eyes that she understood exactly how to make this hurt most. She had not punished them immediately. That would have been too simple, too quick, too merciful. Instead, she had confiscated the hymnal, had ordered them both back to their regular duties, had said nothing more about the incident for the rest of that day. The waiting had been its own torture. Samuel and Ezra had moved through their tasks in tense silence, knowing that punishment was coming but not knowing its form, anticipating pain but unable to prepare for it because Cordelia's cruelty was nothing if not creative. 3 days later, on a Tuesday afternoon while Samuel was polishing silver in the dining room, Cordelia had summoned him to the parlor. She had been sitting at her writing desk, pen in hand, and she had not looked up when he entered. "Ezra has been sold," she had said, her voice as casual as if she were commenting on the weather. "To a trader heading for the Louisiana sugar fields. He left this morning." The words had not immediately made sense. Samuel's mind had refused to process them, had scrambled for some alternative meaning that didn't carry the weight of what she was actually saying. Sold. Louisiana sugar fields. Those words were a death sentence. Everyone knew that the sugar plantations worked enslaved people to death within years, that the labor was so brutal and the conditions so harsh that life expectancy could be measured in seasons rather than decades. "I didn't punish you for the reading," Cordelia had continued, finally looking up from her writing with those cold, pale eyes. "I punished you for the presumption. For believing you could have something, friendship, hope, knowledge, that I didn't explicitly grant you. Every good thing in your life exists because I allow it, Samuel. And I can take it away just as easily." Samuel had stood frozen, unable to speak, unable to move, unable to do anything but absorb the magnitude of what she had done. She had not whipped Ezra. She had not locked him in the root cellar or burned his hands or subjected him to any of the immediate, finite punishments that could be endured and recovered from. Instead, she had erased him, had sent him to a slow death in the cane fields, had transformed him from a person into a lesson. "You'll live a long life here, Samuel," Cordelia had said, returning to her writing. "I promise you that. You'll watch everyone you dare to care about suffer and disappear, and you'll understand that it's your caring that causes their pain. That's the punishment for your presumption. Now go draw my bath." He had walked out of that parlor in a daze. His feet had carried him through the house automatically, his hands had performed their tasks without conscious direction. He had gone to the kitchen where Ezra should have been, had seen the empty space where his friend had worked, had felt the absence like a physical wound. The other kitchen workers had avoided his eyes, and he had understood that they knew, that everyone knew, and that no one could acknowledge it because acknowledging it meant acknowledging the precariousness of their own existence. That night, lying on his pallet in the small room off the kitchen where house servants slept, Samuel had finally allowed himself to cry. Not quietly, he had not cared if anyone heard. He had sobbed with a grief that went beyond the loss of his friend, that encompassed his mother's death and his own helplessness and the crushing weight of a system designed to destroy any spark of humanity that tried to persist within it. But grief, he had discovered, can only sustain itself for so long before it transforms into something else. By morning, the tears had stopped. In their place was a clarity so cold and sharp it felt like a blade. Cordelia was right, he would watch everyone he cared about suffer and disappear. Unless she disappeared first. The thought had come to him fully formed, not as a wild impulse but as a logical conclusion. She had taught him, through years of cruelty, that submission brought no safety. She had taught him that love was a vulnerability she would exploit. She had taught him that his life would be an endless repetition of loss and suffering, that survival meant watching everything worth living for be systematically destroyed. The only variable he could control was her. Remove her, and perhaps others would be spared. Perhaps the next mistress of Blackridge estate would be merely indifferent rather than actively sadistic. Perhaps without Cordelia's creative cruelty, the house servants would have marginally better lives. Perhaps Ezra's sacrifice could mean something if it prevented future sacrifices. Or perhaps none of that was true. Perhaps he would die for nothing, would be remembered only as a murderer, would find in death no more dignity than he had found in life. But the certainty that had settled over Samuel in those dark morning hours was this: continuing to exist as Cordelia's victim was no longer tolerable. Death was coming for him eventually, the question was whether he would meet it as property that had finally broken, or as a person who had made one final, terrible choice. Over the following 3 weeks, he had planned. Not elaborately, there was no need for complexity when opportunity presented itself twice daily in the form of bathing rituals. He simply waited, watching, preparing himself mentally for an act he knew could never be undone. And on a Thursday afternoon in August, when the heat pressed down like a suffocating blanket and the house was quiet and Cordelia summoned him to prepare her bath, Samuel had finally stopped waiting. He had locked the door. And everything that came after was inevitable. If you're finding this story as haunting as I am, please take a moment to subscribe and hit that notification bell. And I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. What would you have done in his position? Let me know below. The Thursday afternoon that would define the remainder of Samuel's life, all 14 hours of it, as things would turn out, began with oppressive heat that made the air itself feel solid. August in Mississippi was always brutal, but this particular day carried a weight that went beyond mere temperature. The sky had taken on a peculiar yellow-gray cast that suggested storms building somewhere beyond the horizon, though no rain would come to break the tension. The magnolia trees stood motionless in air too thick to stir even their heavy leaves. Even the insects seemed subdued, their usual droning reduced to occasional half-hearted buzzes. Samuel had moved through his morning duties with the mechanical precision that had become second nature. He had served Cordelia's breakfast, poached eggs and toast points, coffee with cream measured to exact specifications. He had helped her dress, his scarred fingers working the tiny buttons and hooks with practiced efficiency while his mind remained somewhere else, somewhere beyond the immediate reality of fabric and flesh. He had stood behind her while she sat at her vanity, brushing her dark hair the required 100 strokes, counting silently while staring at her reflection without really seeing it. She had been in a good mood that morning, which was somehow worse than her rages. When Cordelia was pleased, it meant she was planning something, that her satisfaction came from anticipating some future cruelty she would orchestrate. She had hummed while Samuel brushed her hair, a Mozart piece she was learning for an upcoming recital. The sound had made his skin crawl. At precisely 2 o'clock, as she did every afternoon, Cordelia had rung the small silver bell that summoned him to prepare her bath. The routine had been identical for 2 years. He would go to the bathing room, would build up the fire to heat the water, would carry bucket after bucket from the kitchen to fill the copper tub, would test the temperature repeatedly until it met her exacting standards, would add the lavender oil she preferred, would lay out fresh towels and her silk bathing gown, would ensure everything was perfect before returning to inform her that all was ready. But on this afternoon, Samuel had added one step to the ritual. After laying out the towels, after testing the water temperature one final time, after everything was prepared exactly as she required, he had turned the heavy brass key in the lock. The mechanism had moved smoothly, well-oiled and silent. The bolt had seated itself with a soft click that seemed impossibly loud in the quiet room. That simple rotation of metal through 180 degrees had been the point of no return, the moment when thought became action, when desperation crystallized into terrible purpose. His hands had been shaking as he turned that key. They were shaking still as he went to inform Cordelia that her bath was ready. She had swept past him without a word, her silk dress rustling, leaving a trail of perfume that smelled like flowers and cruelty. He had followed 3 steps behind, as protocol demanded, his heart hammering so hard he was certain she must hear it. She had entered the bathing room, had glanced around with her usual critical eye, searching for some imperfection that would justify punishment. Finding none, she had waved him toward the door dismissively. "Fetch the heated towels from downstairs," she had said, beginning to unfasten her dress. "The ones by the stove. I want them properly warm this time." This was the moment. This was the deviation from routine that would announce his intentions or allow him to retreat back into the familiar pattern of submission. For a heartbeat, Samuel had stood paralyzed, his body frozen between 2 futures, one where he left the room and remained a victim, one where he stayed and became a killer. He stayed. Cordelia had noticed immediately. She had paused in the act of removing her dress, had turned to look at him with an expression of irritation giving way to confusion. "Did you not hear me?" I said. "No," Samuel had said. Just that single word, quiet but absolute. The confusion on her face had sharpened into something else as she had looked at him, really looked at him, and seen whatever was written in his expression. Her eyes had moved to the door, and Samuel had watched the realization dawn. Her hand had moved toward the bell pull near the bathtub, the one that would summon help from elsewhere in the house. He had moved faster than he knew he could move, had crossed the space between them and grabbed her wrist before her fingers could close on the velvet rope. She had tried to pull away, had opened her mouth to scream, and in that moment all the planning and preparation and cold clarity had evaporated into pure instinct. He had pushed her. Not elegantly, not with skill or technique, just a desperate shove that sent her stumbling backward toward the tub. She had caught the edge with her legs, had lost her balance, had fallen into the water still half-dressed, the copper tub ringing like a bell with the impact. Water had surged over the sides, splashing across the marble floor in waves that soaked through Samuel's thin shoes. Cordelia had surfaced immediately, gasping, furious, already forming words that would promise punishments beyond Samuel's worst nightmares. But he had not given her time to speak. He had lunged forward, had planted his hands on her shoulders, had pushed down with every ounce of strength his small body possessed. She had fought. God, how she had fought. Her hands had come up, clawing at his arms, his wrists, anything she could reach. Her nails had raked across his skin, opening long scratches that burned and bled. She had thrashed beneath the surface, her body bucking with desperate strength, creating waves that sloshed water across the floor in rhythmic surges. Her feet had kicked, striking the sides of the tub with hollow booming sounds, hitting Samuel's shins with enough force to bruise. The water was hot, exactly the temperature she had demanded, and the heat made everything worse. Steam rose between them, obscuring vision, making the air even harder to breathe. Samuel's hand slipped on her wet shoulders, and for a terrifying moment he thought she would surface, would overpower him, would survive to deliver a retribution he could not imagine. But he had adjusted his grip, had pressed down harder, had locked his elbows and put his full weight into keeping her under. His face was inches from the churning surface. He could see her pale eyes wide beneath the water, could see her mouth opening and closing, could see the bubbles escaping from her nose and lips as her lungs expelled air and desperately sought more. Those bubbles rose in silver streams, breaking the surface with soft pops that seemed obscene in their gentleness, in the way they suggested something peaceful rather than this violent struggle for life itself. Samuel was crying. The tears streamed down his face unchecked, mixing with the bathwater spray and the steam. He was sobbing, great, wrenching sounds that came from somewhere deep in his chest, sounds of grief and horror and desperation that his voice had been producing without his awareness. His arms shook with exhaustion and emotion, but they did not weaken. Could not weaken. To release her now would be to choose his own death while guaranteeing hers later, and if he was going to die, and he knew with absolute certainty he was going to die for this, then at least she would not survive to hurt anyone else. Cordelia's struggles were weakening. The clawing at his arms became less coordinated, the thrashing less violent. Her movements took on a jerky, spasmodic quality that was somehow more horrible than the earlier fight, suggesting a body acting on reflex rather than conscious command. The bubbles came less frequently. The water began to still. Samuel counted. 1, 2, 3. His mother's gift, the numbers she had taught him before fever took her, now being used to measure out a life ending. 20. 30. 40. He counted through the tears, through the shaking, through the knowledge that each number was a step further from anything resembling innocence. 70. 80. 90. At 100, Cordelia's body had gone completely still. At 150, Samuel had allowed himself to believe it might be over. At 200, he had finally released his grip. His hands came away slowly, reluctantly, as though they had forgotten how to unfold themselves from their killing purpose. He stepped back, his legs nearly giving out, and watched as Cordelia's body settled in the water. She floated face down, her dark hair spreading around her head in tendrils that moved with the water's residual motion. Her arms hung suspended, fingers slightly curled. The silk of her partially removed dress billowed around her, creating the illusion of movement where there was now only stillness. Samuel slid down the wall until he was sitting on the wet marble floor, water soaking through his pants, his back against the plaster. He stared at the copper tub, at the body it contained, at his own hands trembling in his lap, scarred from her previous cruelties, now bloodied from her final struggle, transformed in the space of minutes into instruments of death. The silence in the aftermath was absolute and suffocating. Outside, the afternoon continued its indifferent progress. Birds sang. Somewhere in the house, dishes clinked in the kitchen. Life went on, utterly unaware that in this marble room with its cooling bath water and floating corpse, something fundamental had shifted, some line had been crossed that could never be uncrossed. Samuel felt no triumph, no satisfaction, none of the righteous vindication that stories of rebellion sometimes promised. He felt only exhaustion and a hollow grief for something lost that he could not quite name. Perhaps it was whatever remained of his childhood. Perhaps it was the last fragment of hope that the world could be anything other than brutal. Perhaps it was simply the acknowledgement that in destroying her, he had destroyed himself as well. He sat there on the wet floor for a time he could not measure, staring at nothing, thinking of Ezra marching south in chains, of his mother dying in the quarters, of all the small deaths he had witnessed and endured. And gradually, slowly, a strange peace settled over him. She could not hurt anyone else. Whatever came next, and he knew what came next, at least she was gone. Before we continue with what happened next, if you're appreciating these deep dives into dark history, please consider subscribing. Your support helps me bring these forgotten stories to light. And drop a comment, do you think this was justice or murder? Samuel did not run. Perhaps that was the detail that surprised the White household most when the discovery was made, that he had not attempted escape, had not tried to hide or fabricate some story that might delay the inevitable. He had simply unlocked the door, left it slightly ajar as though inviting discovery, and walked through the house with water dripping from his clothes, leaving a trail across the expensive carpets that no one had yet noticed. He had returned to the small room off the kitchen where he slept, had sat down on his thin pallet, and had waited. His hands rested in his lap, still trembling slightly, the scratches on his wrists already beginning to scab over. He did not think about what was coming. He did not pray, though perhaps he should have. He simply sat in a state of strange emptiness, as though the act of killing had hollowed him out, leaving behind only a shell that breathed and waited for its ending. The scream came perhaps an hour later. A housemaid, Mary, a woman in her 30s who managed the upstairs cleaning, had gone to check on the mistress when Cordelia had not emerged for her afternoon tea. The sound that came from the bathing room was primal, a shriek of terror and shock that brought the entire household running. Within moments, the house erupted into chaos, servants shouting, footsteps pounding through hallways, doors slamming as people rushed to see what horror had occurred. Samuel heard it all from his pallet. He did not move. He simply waited, knowing that eventually someone would remember him, would realize he had been the one to prepare the bath, would come looking. The waiting lasted perhaps 10 minutes, though it felt longer. Then the door to his room had burst open, and the overseer, a thick-necked man named Dutch Calloway, had stood there with 2 field hands behind him. "Get up," Dutch had said, his face flushed red with rage or exertion or both. "Master wants you. Now." Samuel had stood without resistance, had walked between his escorts through the house that had been his prison for 7 years. They had taken him to the parlor, where Master Thaddeus Blackridge stood beside the fireplace, his face ashen. Thaddeus had returned from Natchez only an hour before, riding hard when word had reached him in town about his wife's death. He looked older than his 54 years in that moment, diminished somehow, as though tragedy had physically compressed him. "Did you do this?" Thaddeus had asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Samuel had looked at the man who owned him, who owned his labor and his body and legally could do whatever he wished with both, and he had told the truth. "Yes, sir." The confession had produced a moment of stunned silence. Dutch had actually taken a step back, as though Samuel's admission carried some physical force. Thaddeus had gripped the mantelpiece, his knuckles white. The simplicity of it, the lack of denial, the absence of pleading or excuse, had seemed to unsettle everyone in the room more than the act itself. "Why?" Thaddeus had finally asked, and Samuel had seen genuine confusion in his eyes. The master of Blackridge estate could not fathom what would drive property to destroy its owner. Samuel had not answered. There was no answer he could give that would translate across the unbridgeable gap between their realities. How could he explain to a man who owned human beings that being owned had become unbearable? How could he make someone who benefited from cruelty understand that cruelty had consequences? The investigation that followed was brutal and thorough. They had questioned every house servant, certain that Samuel could not have acted alone, that there must have been a conspiracy, a plot, perhaps even outside agitation from abolitionists. They had used methods of interrogation that left several servants unable to work for days afterward. But they found nothing, because there was nothing to find. This had been Samuel's act alone, one desperate boy and one terrible moment of clarity. The white investigators struggled with this conclusion. Their entire worldview required enslaved people to be childlike, incapable of complex thought or independent action. The idea that a 14-year-old boy had planned and executed a murder challenged fundamental assumptions about the nature of slavery itself. So they kept searching, kept questioning, kept refusing to accept the simple truth that Samuel offered them repeatedly: he had done this alone, and he had done it because continuing to live under Cordelia's cruelty had become impossible. The trial was a formality that lasted less than an hour. Mississippi law was explicit: enslaved people who killed white people received death, period. There were no mitigating circumstances, no consideration of provocation, no possibility of mercy. The judge, a portly man named Silas Crawford who owned a neighboring plantation, had barely looked at Samuel during the proceedings. The verdict was delivered with the same casual efficiency one might use to condemn a rabid dog. Samuel was to hang at dawn on Monday, September 8, 1845, in the town square of Natchez. For days between sentence and execution, not because justice required deliberation, but because the gallows needed to be constructed and the execution properly advertised. They wanted an audience. They wanted other enslaved people to witness what happened to those who stepped outside their prescribed roles. They wanted the spectacle of punishment to reinforce the system itself. Those 4 days Samuel spent in a cell beneath the courthouse, a stone room 8 feet square with a tiny window near the ceiling that let in only enough light to mark the passage of time. They fed him adequately. There was a strange mercy in that, or perhaps just a desire that he be strong enough to walk to the gallows without assistance. He was alone with his thoughts and the approaching certainty of death, and he found that he was not as frightened as he had expected to be. On the morning of September 8, they came for him before dawn. They chained his hands and led him through streets already lined with spectators, white families who had brought children to witness the lesson, enslaved people who had been forced to attend, merchants and farmers and townspeople who had come for the entertainment. The gallows stood in the center of the square, rough-hewn pine wood that still smelled of sap, 13 steps leading up to a platform that Samuel would never descend. He climbed those steps with a steadiness that seemed to disturb the crowd. They had expected him to cry, to beg, to provide them with a display of brokenness that would confirm their beliefs about the natural order. Instead, Samuel walked with quiet dignity, his head up, his expression calm. When they asked if he had any last words, he spoke clearly enough that his voice carried across the assembled crowd. "I ain't sorry." 3 words. Simple and absolute. Not a justification, not an apology, not even an explanation. Just a statement of fact that rippled through the crowd like a stone thrown into still water. Some people gasped. Others muttered angrily. But everyone heard, and everyone understood the defiance in that declaration. They hanged him as the sun rose, painting the eastern sky in shades of gold and crimson that seemed almost obscene in their beauty. Samuel was 14 years old. He had lived his entire life as property, and he died having claimed, for one brief moment, the autonomy to choose how his story would end. But death was not the end of Samuel's story, at least not in the collective memory of Blackridge estate. Within weeks of his execution, the household servants began reporting strange occurrences in the bathing room. The sound of water splashing when the room was empty. Steam rising from the copper tub though no fire had been lit. The smell of lavender oil and something else, something metallic and wrong. The housemaids refused to enter the room alone, and eventually they refused to enter it at all. Cordelia's bathroom became a sealed space, a room in the house that everyone avoided. Master Thaddeus remarried within a year, a widow from Louisiana who lasted only 6 months before demanding they leave Mississippi entirely. She claimed she heard sounds in that room, claimed she saw water seeping under the door when the tub was dry, claimed she woke at night to the sensation of wet hands pressing down on her shoulders. After the Civil War, when Union troops occupied Natchez and the Blackridge fortune collapsed along with the Confederacy, the estate was abandoned. The house fell into decay, claimed by weather and time and the slow revenge of nature reclaiming what had been stolen from it. But the stories persisted. Locals claimed that on humid August evenings, when the air hung heavy and still, you could hear sounds coming from the ruins. Water churning. Someone struggling to breathe. And sometimes, carried on the wind, 3 words whispered with quiet defiance, "I ain't sorry." Whether these stories represented actual supernatural phenomena or simply the collective memory of a community processing its own complicity in horror, the effect was the same. Samuel's act, and his final words, became legend. The story was passed down through generations, transformed and embellished, but always retaining its essential truth. A child had been pushed so far that death seemed preferable to submission, and in choosing how he would die, he had claimed a dignity that the system of slavery had tried desperately to deny him. The real haunting at Blackridge estate was not Samuel's ghost, if such things existed. It was the knowledge that the institution of slavery had been so brutal, so complete in its dehumanization, that it had made a 14-year-old boy into a killer. It was the understanding that every act of resistance, no matter how desperate, how violent, how ultimately futile, stood as testimony against a system that demanded absolute submission from those it enslaved. Samuel's hands had become instruments of death because they had been given no other choice. The real horror was not the act of drowning itself, but the accumulation of cruelty and suffering that had made such an act inevitable. Cordelia had died in that copper bathtub, but she had been killed by something larger than one desperate boy. She had been killed by the very system of brutality she had exploited and embodied. If this story moved you or made you think differently about this dark period of history, please subscribe to support this channel. I'd also love to hear your perspective in the comments. Was this an act of survival or revenge?